I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the certified letter in my mailbox with the HOA logo stamped across the envelope. My name is Connor Ingram, and I had just inherited my great-grandfather's house in Charleston, South Carolina, 6 months earlier. The house wasn't just any property. It was a stunning 1891 Victorian masterpiece that had been in my family for 4 generations, complete with ornate gingerbread trim, a wraparound porch with original columns, and stained glass windows that caught the morning sun in ways that made the whole interior glow like a cathedral. The house sat in the historic district of Charleston, a neighborhood that had somehow, inexplicably, been taken over by a homeowners association about 15 years ago when the area was rezoned. I tore open the envelope standing right there by the mailbox, my coffee still steaming in my other hand. The letter was typed in that aggressive all-caps format that certain people love to use when they think it makes them more official. Notice of violation, it read. Your property at 247 Magnolia Street has been found to be in violation of HOA standards. The following modifications must be made within 60 days. 1. Remove all decorative trim from exterior. Gingerbread-style ornamentation is not consistent with neighborhood aesthetic. 2. Replace stained glass windows with standard clear glass windows. 3. Paint exterior in approved color, list attached. 4. Remove wraparound porch or modify to standard front porch only. 5. Replace original front door with HOA-approved modern door. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $500. I read it 3 times, certain I was missing something. They wanted me to essentially destroy everything that made this house architecturally significant. The gingerbread trim alone was irreplaceable. It had been hand-carved by craftsmen in the 1890s. The stained glass windows were original to the house. This wasn't just some quirky old building. This was a piece of Charleston history. I walked back inside, my morning completely ruined. The house creaked around me in that comfortable way old houses do, like it was greeting me. I had spent the last 6 months carefully restoring small details, fixing what needed fixing while preserving every original element I could. My great-grandfather had been meticulous about maintaining the house, and he had passed that responsibility to me through his will, along with a thick binder of documentation about the home's historical significance. That binder. I suddenly remembered the binder. I found it in the study, a heavy 3-ring binder with plastic sleeves protecting decades of documents. Inside were original architectural drawings, photographs from the 1890s, historical society letters, and most importantly, a certificate from 1983 declaring the house a state historic landmark. I had looked through it once when I inherited the property, but hadn't paid much attention to the legal implications. Now, I read every word carefully. The house had been designated as historically significant by the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. There were protections in place. Legal protections. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number listed on the HOA letter. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. Magnolia Street HOA, this is Brenda speaking. Hi, this is Connor Ingram from 247 Magnolia Street. I just received a violation notice, and I think there has been a mistake. No mistake, Mr. Ingram. Her voice was pleasant but firm. Your property is not in compliance with our community standards. But my house is a state historic landmark. It is protected by state law. You cannot force modifications to a historically designated property. There was a pause. Mr. Ingram, when properties in this neighborhood became part of the HOA, all owners agreed to abide by our covenants and restrictions. Your great-grandfather signed those documents in 2009. That doesn't override state historic preservation laws. We will see about that. The 60-day notice stands. Have a good day. She hung up. I stood there with the phone in my hand, anger building in my chest. This was insane. I called the South Carolina Department of Archives and History next. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached someone in the Historic Preservation Office. Historic Preservation. This is Marcus Chen speaking. I explained the situation as clearly as I could. There was a long silence on the other end. They want you to remove original 1890s architectural elements from a designated landmark. Marcus sounded genuinely shocked. Mr. Ingram, that is absolutely not legal. Your property is protected under the National Historic Preservation Act as well as state regulations. No HOA covenant can supersede federal and state historic preservation law. That is what I thought, but the HOA seems to think differently. You have your landmark documentation. Yes, everything. Good. I am going to open a case file immediately. This is actually a serious matter. Attempting to force modifications to a designated historic property could result in significant penalties for the HOA. I will need you to send me copies of all correspondence from the HOA, along with your landmark certificate and any other relevant documentation. I felt relief wash over me. Thank you. I will get that to you today. In the meantime, do not make any modifications to your property. Document everything. If the HOA attempts to enter your property or threatens you in any way, contact us immediately and consider getting legal representation. After hanging up, I scanned every document from the binder and the HOA letter, then emailed everything to Marcus. Then I sat down to figure out my next move. The HOA violated my property rights and apparently had no understanding of historic preservation law. But who was really behind this? I looked at the signature on the violation letter. Patricia Whitmore, HOA President. I had never met Patricia Whitmore, but I was about to. That afternoon, I walked 3 blocks down to the address listed on the HOA letterhead. It was a large, modern McMansion that looked completely out of place among the historic homes. The house was beige with white trim, utterly characterless, with a perfectly manicured lawn and not a single tree or interesting feature anywhere on the property. I rang the doorbell. A woman in her late 40s answered, blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, wearing workout clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking me up and down with obvious disapproval. "Patricia Whitmore. I am Connor Ingram. I received your violation notice today." Her face hardened immediately. "Oh, the Victorian monstrosity. Yes, I trust you will be making the necessary changes." "No, actually. My house is a state historic landmark. It is protected by law. You cannot force me to modify it." She crossed her arms. "Mr. Ingram, I don't think you understand how HOAs work. When your great-grandfather joined this association, he agreed to our rules. Your house is an eyesore that brings down property values for the entire neighborhood. Those ridiculous decorations and old-fashioned windows make the whole street look dated. The whole street is a historic district. That is the point. And state law protects my property from exactly this kind of interference. We will see what our lawyer has to say about that." She started to close the door. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have already contacted the State Historic Preservation Office. They are opening a case file. If you continue to pursue this, the HOA could face serious legal consequences." She paused, her expression shifting to something between anger and uncertainty. "Are you threatening me?" "I am informing you of the legal reality. My house is protected. Your violation notice is unenforceable. Get off my property." She slammed the door. I walked back home feeling even more unsettled. Patricia Whitmore was not going to back down easily. I could see it in her eyes. This was about control for her, about enforcing her vision of what the neighborhood should look like regardless of history, heritage, or apparently the law. Over the next week, things escalated quickly. I received another letter, this time informing me that I was being fined $500 per day starting immediately for non-compliance. I forwarded it to Marcus at the Historic Preservation Office and also decided it was time to get a lawyer. I found an attorney named Richard Saunders who specialized in property law and had experience with HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Charleston, in one of those beautifully restored buildings that made the city famous. Richard was in his 60s, with gray hair and a weathered face that suggested he had seen every kind of property dispute imaginable. He read through my documents carefully, occasionally making notes. "This is pretty straightforward," he finally said. "The HOA has no legal standing whatsoever. Your state landmark designation predates their covenants, and even if it didn't, historic preservation law supersedes HOA regulations. The fact that they are attempting to enforce fines is actually actionable. We can sue them for harassment and seek an injunction preventing any further violation notices or fines. How long will that take? Depends on how reasonable they want to be. If they back down immediately, we can settle this in a few weeks. If they want to fight, it could take months, but we will win. The law is absolutely clear on this. They are charging me $500 a day. They can charge whatever they want. It doesn't mean it is enforceable. Don't pay a single dollar. We will make sure those fines are voided and possibly seek damages for the stress and legal costs they are causing you." I left Richard's office feeling better but still anxious. The idea of a prolonged legal battle was exhausting, and I had only lived in the house for 6 months. This was supposed to be my fresh start after a difficult divorce and a career change. Instead, I was fighting to preserve my own home. 2 weeks later, I received a knock on my door at 8 in the morning. I opened it to find Patricia Whitmore standing there with 2 other women and a man holding a clipboard. "Mr. Ingram," Patricia said coldly, "we are here for an official property inspection. As HOA president, I have the authority to inspect any property in the community for compliance purposes." "No, you don't, not without my permission, and I don't give it. The HOA covenants clearly state, I don't care what the covenants say. You are not entering my property. If you attempt to, I will call the police." The man with the clipboard stepped forward. "Mr. Ingram, I am Dale Henderson, the HOA's attorney. I strongly suggest you cooperate. Your refusal to allow inspection will result in additional fines. Then you can add those imaginary fines to the other imaginary fines I am not paying. My attorney has already filed an injunction against the HOA. You should be receiving those papers any day now." Patricia's face turned red. This is exactly the kind of attitude that makes you unfit for this community. You think because you inherited some old house that you can disregard the rules that everyone else follows. Your property is a blight. It is tacky and outdated, and it makes the entire neighborhood look bad. My property is a historic landmark. It was here long before your HOA existed, and it will be here long after. Now get off my porch." One of the other women who had been silent until now spoke up. She was younger, maybe in her 30s, with an expensive-looking handbag and too much makeup. "You know, people like you are so selfish. You only think about what you want. You don't care how your choices affect property values for the rest of us. Some of us have investments to protect." "Investments?" I felt my temper rising. "This is my home. My family's home for over a century. If you wanted a neighborhood full of identical beige boxes, You should have moved somewhere else instead of trying to turn a historic district into a suburban wasteland." Dale Henderson held up a hand. "Mr. Ingram, hostility is not productive. We are simply trying to maintain community standards." Community standards that violate state and federal historic preservation law. You are not going to win this. I suggest you talk to your own legal counsel about the implications of what you are trying to do. I closed the door and locked it. Through the window, I watched them stand on my porch for another minute, talking among themselves before finally leaving. My hands were shaking. I hated confrontation, but I was not going to let them bully me into destroying my great-grandfather's house. That afternoon, Richard called me. "Good news. The injunction was approved. The HOA is legally barred from pursuing any further violations, fines, or harassment related to your property pending the outcome of the case. I am also filing a motion to have all existing fines voided." How did Patricia take it? I have no idea. "The papers were just served an hour ago, but I expect we will hear something soon." He was right. 2 days later, I received a hand-delivered letter from Dale Henderson, the HOA's attorney. It was surprisingly conciliatory in tone. "Dear Mr. Ingram, after reviewing the legal complexities of your situation, the HOA board would like to propose a compromise. While we maintain that the HOA covenants are binding, we recognize that your property's historic designation creates certain complications. We propose the following. If you agree to make modest modifications, such as painting the exterior in a color more consistent with the neighborhood, and perhaps toning down some of the more elaborate decorative elements, we would be willing to waive all fines and withdraw the violation notice." I called Richard immediately and read him the letter. "It is a trap," he said bluntly. "They are trying to get you to agree to any modification, which would set a precedent that you acknowledge their authority over the property. Once you agree to one thing, they will keep pushing for more. My advice is to reject it completely." That is what I thought. Should I respond? I will respond on your behalf. We will make it clear that no modifications of any kind are on the table and that the HOA needs to drop this entirely or face a lawsuit for damages. You think it will come to that? A lawsuit, honestly? Yes. Patricia Whitmore strikes me as the type who cannot stand to lose. She will drag this out as long as she can. Richard was right again. Over the next month, the situation became increasingly bizarre. Patricia started a neighborhood petition to address concerns about property maintenance standards. She went door to door, collecting signatures from neighbors who apparently agreed that my house was a problem. I found a copy of the petition stuffed in my mailbox one morning. It claimed that my refusal to maintain modern aesthetic standards was negatively impacting community cohesion and property values. I recognized a few of the signatures. Some were neighbors I had never even met. Others were people I had spoken to in passing who had always seemed friendly. Seeing their names on that petition felt like a betrayal, even though I knew Patricia had probably misrepresented the situation to them. But not everyone signed it. 3 days after finding the petition, I had a visitor. An elderly woman named Dorothy Fisher from 2 streets over knocked on my door carrying a plate of cookies. "Mr. Ingram, I am Dorothy. I have lived in this neighborhood for 43 years. I wanted you to know that not everyone supports what Patricia is doing. Your great-grandfather was a wonderful man, and this house is one of the few remaining treasures in this neighborhood. What she is trying to do is disgraceful." I invited her in, and we sat in the living room where the afternoon light was streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the original hardwood floors. "I remember when the HOA was first proposed," Dorothy said, sipping tea I had made. It was supposed to be about basic maintenance standards. You know, making sure people kept their lawns neat and didn't paint their houses crazy colors. But Patricia got elected president 5 years ago, and she has turned it into something else entirely. She wants everything to look like a magazine spread. No personality, no history, just bland uniformity. Why doesn't anyone stop her? Most people are afraid of her. She can make your life miserable if you cross her. She has successfully driven out 3 families with constant violations and fines over the smallest things. People just go along with what she wants because it is easier than fighting. I can't do that. I won't let her destroy this house. Dorothy smiled. Good. It is about time someone stood up to her. If you need anything, any kind of support or testimony about the historical value of this property, you let me know. I have photographs of this neighborhood going back decades. I know what it used to look like before people started tearing down the old homes and putting up those awful modern boxes. After Dorothy left, I felt less alone. But the situation was far from over. The next escalation came in the form of a city building inspector showing up at my door. He was a tired-looking man in his 50s carrying an official tablet and wearing a city ID badge. Connor Ingram. I am Steve Patterson from the building department. We received a complaint about possible code violations at this address. I need to do an inspection. What kind of code violations? The complaint alleges unsafe electrical wiring, potential structural issues, and mold. That is ridiculous. This house has been professionally inspected twice in the last year. Everything is up to code. I am sure it is, but I still have to follow up on the complaint. Can I come in? I let him in because refusing would only make things worse. Steve spent 2 hours going through the house, checking everything from the foundation to the attic. I followed him, answering questions and showing him the inspection reports I had from when I inherited the property. Finally, he closed his tablet and shook his head. Mr. Ingram, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this house. In fact, it is in better condition than 90% of the properties I inspect. Someone filed a completely false complaint. Let me guess. Patricia Whitmore. He glanced at me, and I could see in his eyes that I was right. I cannot discuss who filed the complaint, but for what it is worth, this is the 3rd bogus complaint I have investigated in this neighborhood in the last 2 years, all involving properties that were in disputes with the HOA. I am going to note in my report that this appears to be a harassment tactic, which could have consequences for whoever filed it. After Steve left, I called Richard again. Patricia filed a false building complaint against me. Of course she did. The good news is that gives us more ammunition. Filing false complaints with city agencies is a serious matter. Forward me the inspector's report when you get it, and we will add it to our case. How much longer is this going to go on? We have a hearing scheduled in 3 weeks. The judge will review the historic designation, the HOA's attempted enforcement, and all the harassment. Unless Patricia is completely delusional, this should end there. 3 weeks felt like an eternity, but I tried to focus on other things. I continued working on the house, carefully restoring small details. I met with Marcus from the Historic Preservation Office, who came out to do his own inspection and documentation. He took extensive photographs and measurements and interviewed me about the house's history. This is really an exceptional property, Marcus said as we stood on the front porch. The craftsmanship is incredible. These columns are original heart pine. You can't even get wood like this anymore. And the stained glass work is museum quality. My great-grandfather always said this house was built by people who cared about creating something beautiful, not just functional. He was right. You are doing the right thing by protecting it. I am going to make sure our office files a formal objection to the HOA's actions. What they are trying to do is not just illegal, it is an assault on cultural heritage. The day of the hearing finally arrived. It was held in the Charleston County Courthouse, a beautiful old building that ironically was itself a historic landmark. Richard met me outside, ready, as I will ever be. We entered the courtroom, a wood-paneled space that felt appropriately serious. Patricia was already there with Dale Henderson and several other HOA board members. She glared at me as I took my seat. The judge was a woman in her 50s named Judge Ellen Morrison. She had a reputation for being fair but tough. She reviewed the documents for several minutes before looking up. "This is an interesting case. Mr. Henderson, you represent the HOA. Please present your argument." Dale stood up. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of contract law. When Mr. Ingram's great-grandfather joined the Homeowners Association, he agreed to abide by the covenants and restrictions. Those covenants require certain aesthetic standards. Mr. Ingram's refusal to comply creates a precedent that undermines the entire purpose of the HOA. And you are aware that the property in question is a designated state historic landmark." "We are, Your Honor, but we believe that the HOA covenants, which were voluntarily agreed to, create a separate binding obligation." Judge Morrison turned to Richard. "Mr. Saunders." Richard stood. "Your Honor, this case is not nearly as complicated as opposing counsel suggests. Under the National Historic Preservation Act and South Carolina state law, properties designated as historic landmarks are protected from alterations that would compromise their historical integrity. This protection supersedes any private covenants or contracts. The HOA is attempting to force my client to remove original 1890s architectural elements, including hand-carved trim, original stained glass windows, and structural features that define the property's historical significance. This is not legal under any interpretation of historic preservation law." "Your Honor," Dale interrupted, "the HOA is not trying to destroy the house. We are simply asking for reasonable modifications to bring it into compliance with community standards." "Reasonable modifications." Richard's voice rose slightly. "They want him to remove irreplaceable 19th-century craftsmanship. They want him to replace original stained glass with modern windows. These are not minor changes. These modifications would destroy the very elements that make the property historically significant." Judge Morrison held up a hand. "I have read the documentation. Mr. Henderson, I have to say I am puzzled by your client's position. The property was designated as a state historic landmark in 1983, more than 20 years before the HOA covenants were created. How can you possibly argue that a private agreement made decades later supersedes existing state protection?" Dale hesitated. "Your Honor, the HOA believes that property owners have the right to create binding agreements about community standards regardless of previous designations, even when those agreements violate state and federal law." "We don't believe they do, Your Honor." Judge Morrison looked at Patricia. "Mrs. Whitmore, you are the HOA president. Can you explain to me why you are pursuing this matter despite clear legal protections for the property?" Patricia stood up, and I could see the anger radiating off her. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is about fairness. Every other property owner in the neighborhood has to follow the rules. Why should Mr. Ingram be exempt just because his house is old? His property looks out of place and outdated. It affects all of our property values. The whole neighborhood suffers because one person refuses to cooperate. Mrs. Whitmore, the property does not just happen to be old. It is legally protected because of its historical and architectural significance. You cannot force someone to destroy protected historical elements." "But it is not fair." Patricia's voice was getting louder. "He knew the rules when he inherited the property. His great-grandfather agreed to them. Judge Morrison's expression hardened. Mrs. Whitmore, I suggest you lower your voice. This is a courtroom, not a neighborhood meeting. And for the record, your sense of what is fair is not relevant when it conflicts with established law. She turned back to the attorneys. I am ready to rule. The HOA's attempted enforcement of violations against Mr. Ingram's property is denied. The property is protected under state and federal historic preservation law, which supersedes any HOA covenants. All fines previously assessed are voided and unenforceable. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent injunction prohibiting the HOA from pursuing any future violations related to the protected historical elements of the property. Your Honor, Dale began, but she cut him off. I am not finished, Mr. Henderson. I am also deeply concerned about what appears to be a pattern of harassment. Filing false building complaints, attempting unauthorized inspections, and continuing to pursue fines after being informed of the legal protections all suggest that your client has been acting in bad faith. Mr. Saunders, does your client wish to pursue damages? Richard glanced at me. We had discussed this possibility. I nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We are seeking compensation for legal fees, time spent dealing with this harassment and emotional distress. I am ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Ingram's legal fees in full. That amount will be calculated and submitted within 30 days. I am also awarding $15,000 in damages for the harassment and stress caused by this frivolous pursuit. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Henderson, I strongly suggest that your organization review its policies and procedures. If I see another case like this come through my courtroom, there will be more serious consequences. Patricia looked like she was about to explode. Dale put a hand on her arm, whispering something urgently. This court is adjourned. Walking out of the courthouse felt surreal. I had won. Completely and decisively, Richard shook my hand. Congratulations. That was about as clear-cut a victory as you can get. Thank you for everything. My pleasure. Cases like this are why I got into property law, protecting something meaningful. You should go home and celebrate. I drove back to Magnolia Street feeling lighter than I had in months. The house looked beautiful in the afternoon sun, its Victorian details casting intricate shadows across the porch. This was worth fighting for. But of course, it was not over. Not really. 2 weeks after the hearing, I was working in the front garden when a car pulled up. Marcus from the Historic Preservation Office got out, looking serious. Connor, we need to talk. What happened? The HOA filed an appeal. They are claiming that the judge's interpretation of historic preservation law was flawed and that HOA covenants should take precedence in neighborhood management. I felt my stomach drop. They are appealing after that ruling. Yes, and it gets worse. They have hired a more aggressive law firm. Patricia apparently convinced the HOA board to authorize significant legal expenses to fight this. Why? What is the point? They lost. The law is clear. Marcus shook his head. This is not really about the law anymore. This is about control and ego. Patricia cannot stand that she lost. From what I have heard, she is telling the HOA board that if they do not fight this, it will set a precedent that undermines the entire association. Can they win an appeal, honestly? No, the law is extremely clear. But they can drag this out, cost you more money and make your life miserable for months or even years. I sat down on the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. This is insane. I know. But here is the thing. The State Historic Preservation Office is not going to let this stand. We are going to intervene in the appeal. This is bigger than just your house now. If an HOA can successfully challenge historic preservation law, it sets a dangerous precedent for protected properties across the entire state. We are going to fight this hard. What do I need to do? For now, nothing. Continue living your life. Don't let them intimidate you. We will handle the legal side. But Connor, I want you to be prepared. This could get uglier before it gets better. He was right. Over the next month, things escalated in ways I could not have imagined. First, someone spray-painted eyesore across my front fence in the middle of the night. I called the police and filed a report. The officer who came out was sympathetic, but said that without witnesses or security camera footage, there was not much they could do. You might want to install cameras, he suggested. I am familiar with your situation. This probably won't be the last incident. I took his advice and installed a comprehensive security system with cameras covering every angle of the property. Good thing I did. 3 nights later, the cameras caught 2 people approaching the house around 2 in the morning. They were wearing dark clothes and had their faces covered, but I could tell from their builds that they were both male. They crept onto the porch and tried to pry off some of the decorative gingerbread trim with a crowbar. The motion sensors triggered the lights and alarm. The 2 figures ran, but not before the cameras got clear footage of them. Even more importantly, one of them dropped his crowbar, and the cameras caught a clear image of a truck parked on the street. A truck with a distinctive business logo on the side. I called the police immediately. This time, a detective came out. His name was Detective Raymond Carter, and he took the vandalism attempt seriously. "You know who these men are?" he asked after reviewing the footage. "No, but that truck belongs to a landscaping company. You can see the logo right there. Henderson's Landscaping." "Okay, we will follow up on this. Mr. Ingram, I want to be straight with you. I have been hearing about your situation with the HOA. This looks like it might be escalating into criminal territory. Have you received any direct threats?" "No direct threats, but the HOA president has made it clear she wants me gone." "Patricia Whitmore." "Yes." Detective Carter nodded slowly. "I know Patricia. We went to high school together, actually. She has always been intense about getting her way. But attempting to vandalize a historic property is serious. If we can connect this to her or the HOA, there could be charges." 2 days later, Detective Carter called me. "We have identified the 2 men from the video. They are employees of Henderson's Landscaping." And here is where it gets interesting. Henderson's Landscaping has a contract with the HOA for neighborhood maintenance. We brought the 2 employees in for questioning, and they initially tried to deny everything, but when we showed them the video evidence, they broke. Patricia Whitmore paid them $500 each to try to remove some of your decorative trim. She told them it was legal, that she had authority as HOA president to enforce neighborhood standards. She paid them to vandalize my house. Yes. We are going to arrest her for conspiracy to commit vandalism and destruction of a historic property. That second charge is a felony in South Carolina when it involves a designated landmark. She is also likely facing charges for filing false building complaints and harassment. I need you to come down to the station and give a formal statement. I gave my statement that afternoon, detailing everything that had happened since I received the first violation notice. The legal staff at the prosecutor's office seemed very interested, especially when I mentioned the pattern of harassment and the appeals that were being filed. Patricia Whitmore was arrested the following day. The local news picked up the story immediately. HOA president arrested for plot to vandalize historic home, ran on 3 different Charleston news channels. The story went viral locally. My phone started ringing with calls from reporters, neighbors, and even people from other HOAs across the state sharing their own nightmare stories. I declined most media requests, but I did agree to one interview with a local reporter who had been covering historic preservation issues. Her name was Teresa Zhang, and she came to the house with a cameraman to do the story properly. "Mr. Ingram, can you tell us how this situation started?" Teresa asked as the camera rolled. I explained the whole timeline, showing her the original violation notice and the documentation of my house's historic designation. She filmed the beautiful architectural details that Patricia had wanted me to destroy. "These are the elements the HOA wanted you to remove?" Teresa asked, filming the intricate gingerbread trim. "Yes, this was all hand-carved in 1891. It is irreplaceable. If someone removed it, that craftsmanship would be lost forever." "And what do you think motivated the HOA to pursue this so aggressively, even after losing in court?" "Honestly, I think it was about control. The HOA president wanted a certain aesthetic for the neighborhood, and she was willing to destroy historic property to achieve it. She didn't care about the law or heritage or anything except her personal vision." The interview aired that evening and got significant attention. By the next morning, the story had been picked up by several national news outlets. Suddenly, my small property dispute had become a national conversation about HOA overreach and historic preservation. The publicity changed everything. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Patricia as president and to drop all appeals and legal actions against me. They issued a public statement apologizing for the situation and promising to review their policies. But the legal consequences for Patricia were just beginning. The charges against her were serious: conspiracy to commit vandalism, attempted destruction of historic property, filing false complaints with city agencies, and harassment. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was not interested in going easy. "This is not just about one property dispute," Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Wells told me when I met with her. "Patricia Whitmore engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation that escalated to attempted vandalism of a protected historic property. We need to send a clear message that this behavior has serious consequences." The trial took place 4 months after Patricia's arrest. I had to testify, describing the entire ordeal from receiving the first violation notice to installing security cameras that caught the vandalism attempt. Patricia's defense was essentially that she believed she was acting within her authority as HOA president, and that she never intended to break any laws. Her attorney tried to portray her as overzealous but not criminal. It did not work. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Morrison, the same judge who had ruled in my favor in the initial civil case, presided over the sentencing. She did not hide her displeasure. "Mrs. Whitmore, you were given a clear ruling explaining why your actions were not legal. Instead of accepting that ruling, you chose to escalate. You paid people to vandalize protected property. You filed false complaints in an attempt to harass someone out of their own home. Your actions were not just illegal. They were an attack on the very principles of law and order in a civilized society. I am sentencing you to 18 months in prison, followed by 2 years of probation. You are also permanently banned from holding any position in any homeowners association, and are ordered to pay full restitution to Mr. Ingram for all damages, legal fees, and emotional distress. That amount totals $73,000. Patricia's face went white. Her attorney started to object, but Judge Morrison cut him off. Your client had every opportunity to stop. She chose not to. She chose to break the law repeatedly and blatantly. This sentence reflects the seriousness of her actions. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief, certainly. satisfaction that justice had been done, but also a strange sadness that it had come to this. Patricia had destroyed her own life over a house that was never hers to control. The story had one final chapter. The publicity surrounding the case had attracted attention from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They contacted me a few weeks after Patricia's sentencing and asked if I would be willing to open the house for occasional tours as an example of successful historic preservation and the importance of protecting architectural heritage. I agreed. Once a month, I started hosting small groups of visitors who were interested in historic architecture and preservation. Dorothy Fisher, my elderly neighbor, volunteered to help with the tours, sharing her memories of the neighborhood's history. The tours became surprisingly popular. People were fascinated by the craftsmanship of the house and inspired by the story of fighting to preserve it. Several other homeowners in Charleston who were facing similar HOA conflicts reached out to me for advice. I connected them with Richard Saunders and Marcus Chen, helping them protect their own historic properties. The HOA itself underwent significant changes. The board hired a new management company and completely rewrote their covenants to include specific protections for historic properties. They even apologized to me formally at a neighborhood meeting and asked if I would be willing to join a committee on historic preservation for the community. I declined the committee position, but accepted the apology. Life was finally returning to normal. One Saturday morning, about a year after the whole ordeal had started, I was sitting on my front porch with coffee, watching the morning sun illuminate the stained glass windows from inside. Dorothy walked by on her morning stroll and came up to chat. "You know, Connor, what you did was important," she said. "Not just for your house, but for the whole neighborhood. People were afraid of Patricia for years. You stood up to her, and you showed everyone that bullies don't win when people are willing to fight back." I was just trying to protect my great-grandfather's house. It was more than that. You protected a piece of history, and you reminded this community of what makes it special. Look around. Since your case made the news, 3 other families have started restoring their historic homes instead of covering them up or tearing them down. You started something good. After Dorothy left, I walked through the house slowly, appreciating every detail. The morning light through the stained glass created those familiar colored patterns on the floor. The original floorboards creaked in their comfortable way. The hand-carved trim seemed to glow in the sunlight. My phone rang. It was Marcus from the Historic Preservation Office. "Connor, I wanted to let you know that we are nominating your house for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. The state designation is good, but National Register status provides even more protection. After everything that happened, we want to make absolutely sure that no one can ever attempt this kind of thing again." "That would be amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Your willingness to fight for this property has raised awareness about preservation issues across the entire state. We have seen a significant increase in applications for historic designation since your story made the news. People are realizing that these protections exist and that they are enforceable." After hanging up, I thought about how strange the last year had been. I had moved to Charleston expecting a quiet life restoring my inherited house. Instead, I had ended up in a legal battle that went all the way to criminal court and changed HOA policies throughout the region. But standing in my great-grandfather's house, surrounded by the craftsmanship of artisans from more than a century ago, I knew it had been worth it. Some things are worth fighting for. History matters. Heritage matters. And sometimes standing up for what is right means refusing to back down, even when it would be easier to just give in. The house would stand for another century at least, protected now by multiple layers of legal designation and by the precedent set through our court victory. Future generations would be able to appreciate the artistry and care that went into creating something beautiful and lasting. That evening, I hosted a small dinner party. Richard Saunders came, along with Marcus Chen and Dorothy. Teresa Zhang, the reporter who had covered the story, also attended. We sat around the original dining table in the formal dining room, eating and sharing stories. "You know what the best part of this whole situation is?" Richard said. "We have had 7 new clients in the last 6 months, all historic property owners dealing with HOA issues. Every single one of them cited your case. We have won every case. HOAs are actually starting to back down when they realize they are dealing with protected properties. You created legal precedent that is protecting homes across the state." "I am getting similar reports," Marcus added. "The Department of Archives and History has fielded dozens of inquiries from property owners asking about historic designation. People are proactively protecting their homes now. It is creating a real cultural shift in how people think about historic preservation." Dorothy raised her glass. "To Connor, for having the courage to fight when everyone told him it would be easier to give in." Everyone raised their glasses. I felt genuinely happy for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. The conversation turned to other topics, and I found myself relaxing into the warmth of friendship and good company. The house seemed to embrace us, its old walls holding our laughter and stories the same way it had held 4 generations of my family's memories. Later that night, after everyone had left, I walked through the house one more time before bed. In the study, I pulled out my great-grandfather's binder and added a new section at the back. I included copies of the court rulings, newspaper clippings about the case, the National Register nomination paperwork, and a letter I wrote explaining everything that had happened. "To whoever inherits this house next," I wrote, "this home is more than just a building. It represents the skill and artistry of people who cared about creating something beautiful. It is protected by law, but more importantly, it is protected by the truth that some things are worth preserving. If anyone ever tries to force you to compromise these protections, stand firm. The law is on your side, and history is worth fighting for." I sealed the letter and placed the binder back in its spot on the shelf. Then I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed. As I climbed the original staircase, my hand trailing along the smooth banister that had been polished by 4 generations of hands, I felt deeply connected to something larger than myself. This house was a trust passed down through my family, and I had honored that trust. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window. It was Sunday, and I had no plans except to enjoy the peace I had fought so hard to protect. I made coffee and took it out to the wraparound porch, settling into the rocking chair that had been my great-grandfather's favorite spot. A young couple walked by pushing a stroller. They slowed down to admire the house. "That is the house from the news," the woman said to her husband. "The one where the guy fought the HOA and won." "It is beautiful," the husband replied. "They don't make houses like this anymore." "No, they don't," the woman agreed. "I am glad he saved it." They smiled at me and continued their walk. I smiled back, rocking gently in the chair. Over the following months, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The house tours became a regular part of my monthly routine. I enjoyed meeting people who appreciated historic architecture and sharing the story of how the house had been preserved. Many visitors left inspired to protect historic properties in their own communities. The legal settlement from Patricia Whitmore arrived in installments as ordered by the court. I used the money to continue careful restoration work on the house. I hired specialists to restore some stained glass panels that had been damaged decades ago. I had the original slate roof professionally repaired. Every improvement honored the house's history rather than trying to modernize it. Dale Henderson, the HOA's original attorney, reached out to me about 8 months after the trial. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I was hesitant but curious, so I agreed. We met at a cafe in downtown Charleston. Dale looked tired and somewhat embarrassed. "Connor, I wanted to apologize personally," he said after we sat down. "I should have researched the historic preservation laws more carefully before advising the HOA to pursue action against your property. I let Patricia's insistence override my professional judgment. What happened was wrong, and I played a role in it. I appreciate you saying that. I have been doing a lot of thinking since the trial. I resigned from representing that HOA board. I am actually specializing in property law now, specifically helping HOAs understand the legal limitations of their authority. I don't want to see another situation like yours happen to anyone else." "That is good to hear. I wanted you to know that the changes you fought for are spreading beyond just this neighborhood. The State HOA Association has revised their model covenants to include specific language protecting historic properties. They are hosting training sessions for HOA boards about respecting historic preservation law. Your case literally changed how HOAs operate in South Carolina." We talked for another hour. Dale shared stories of other HOA disputes he was now helping to resolve before they escalated. It was clear that he genuinely regretted his role in what had happened and was trying to make amends by using his experience to prevent similar situations. As we parted ways, Dale said one more thing. "Patricia is getting out on parole next month. She has served 11 months. I heard she is moving out of state. She lost everything here. Her reputation, her position, her friends. I think the whole experience broke something in her. I felt a pang of sympathy despite everything. That is sad. It didn't have to end that way." "No, it didn't. She made her choices. But I thought you should know, just in case." I never saw or heard from Patricia Whitmore again. True to what Dale had said, she left South Carolina quietly after her release and disappeared from the Charleston community entirely. Life continued. The house stood solid and beautiful through that summer, through the autumn when Charleston's famous gardens bloomed, through a mild winter and into another spring. The National Register of Historic Places designation came through, adding federal protection on top of the state protections that already existed. I started dating someone, a woman named Teresa Zimmerman, who worked as an architect specializing in historic preservation. We met at one of the monthly house tours. She had been fascinated by the Victorian details and the story of fighting to preserve them. We discovered we shared a passion for historic architecture and for protecting Charleston's unique character. Teresa understood the house in ways most people could not. She appreciated the skill that went into every carved detail, every stained glass panel, every carefully crafted element. When she looked at the house, she saw what I saw, not just a building, but a work of art created by people who cared about excellence. One evening, about 18 months after the whole HOA ordeal had begun, Teresa and I were sitting on the front porch watching the sunset. The light was hitting the house at that perfect angle that made all the colors glow. "You ever think about what would have happened if you had just given in?" Teresa asked. "If you had let them force those changes?" "Sometimes. The house would still be standing, but it would not be the same house. All the things that make it special would be gone. It would just be another old building with no character. You did the right thing. Fighting for this house was fighting for something bigger. It was fighting for the idea that beauty and history and craftsmanship matter, that we have a responsibility to preserve the best of what previous generations created. I was terrified most of the time, I admitted. I kept thinking maybe it would be easier to just sell the house and walk away. Let someone else deal with the HOA. But you didn't. No, because this was my great-grandfather's house. He trusted me to protect it, and the more I learned about it, the more I realized it was bigger than just my family. This house is part of Charleston's history. It represents a time when people built things to last, when they cared about beauty for its own sake. Teresa squeezed my hand. We sat in comfortable silence as the sun set and the street lights came on. The house glowed softly in the evening light, solid and permanent. 2 years after inheriting the house, I received an unexpected letter. It was from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, informing me that my great-grandfather's house had been selected to receive their Preservation Achievement Award. The award recognized both the architectural significance of the property and the efforts to protect it from inappropriate modifications. The award ceremony was held in Washington, D.C. Teresa came with me. So did Dorothy Fisher, Richard Saunders, and Marcus Chen. We made it a celebratory trip, proud of what we had accomplished together. At the ceremony, I gave a brief speech about the importance of standing up for historic preservation even when it is difficult. I talked about my great-grandfather's care for the house and about the craftsman in 1891 who built something meant to last generations. Historic preservation is not just about old buildings, I said. It is about remembering that we are part of a continuous story. The people who built my house in 1891 could not have imagined the world we live in now, but they created something beautiful that still has meaning and value today. That is worth protecting. That is worth fighting for. The speech was well received. Afterward, several people approached me with their own stories of fighting to preserve historic properties against various pressures. I exchanged contact information with advocates from across the country, building a network of people committed to preservation. Flying back to Charleston, I felt grateful for how everything had turned out. The nightmare of the HOA conflict had transformed into something positive. Increased awareness about preservation, new legal precedents protecting historic properties, and a community of people committed to honoring architectural heritage. The house itself seemed to thrive with all the attention and care. During restoration work, we discovered original wallpaper preserved under later renovations. We carefully restored it in the formal parlor. We found original light fixtures in the attic that had been removed decades ago and reinstalled them. Every discovery felt like uncovering another piece of the house's story. 3 years after inheriting the property, Teresa moved in with me. She had been spending most of her time at the house anyway, and it felt right to make it official. Together, we continued the restoration work, treating the house as the precious artifact it was. We also started hosting quarterly events, opening the house to architectural students and preservation advocates. The house became an informal classroom where people could learn about Victorian construction techniques, historic craftsmanship, and the importance of preservation law. Dorothy Fisher remained a close friend and regular visitor. She loved seeing young people appreciate the house and the neighborhood's history. She contributed her own photographs and memories to the archive we were building about the property. One afternoon, Dorothy and I were sitting in the garden discussing neighborhood history when she said something that stuck with me. You know, Connor, when Patricia was pushing all the homeowners to modernize their properties and remove historic details, she was not just changing buildings. She was trying to erase memory. She wanted everything to look the same, to fit her vision of what a neighborhood should be. But neighborhoods are not supposed to be uniform. They are supposed to tell stories. Your house tells a story about craftsmanship and beauty and people who built things to last. That story matters. I never thought about it quite that way, but you are right. History is not just dates and events. It is also the physical world around us, the buildings we preserve or destroy, the landscapes we protect or develop. Every choice we make about the environment we live in is a choice about what we remember and what we forget. Those words stayed with me. They helped crystallize why the fight had been so important. It was not just about property rights or architectural details. It was about refusing to let memory be erased, about insisting that beauty and craftsmanship from previous generations still had value. The house continued to attract attention. A documentary filmmaker contacted me about including the property in a film about historic preservation in the South. We agreed, and the filming process was fascinating. The filmmaker spent weeks documenting every detail of the house and interviewing everyone involved in the preservation battle. When the documentary aired on PBS, it reached a national audience. The response was overwhelming. I received hundreds of emails from people sharing their own preservation stories, or asking for advice about protecting historic properties in their communities. The documentary led to speaking invitations. I found myself traveling occasionally to preservation conferences and events, sharing the story and advocating for stronger protections for historic properties. It was never something I had planned, but it felt like important work. Through all of this, the house remained my anchor. No matter how busy life got, coming home to those familiar rooms, that beautiful light through the stained glass windows, the solid feel of original craftsmanship all around me, brought peace and perspective. Teresa and I got engaged in the house's garden on a spring evening 4 years after we met. It felt right to celebrate this new chapter of our lives in a place that represented continuity and commitment to something larger than ourselves. We married the following autumn in the front parlor, surrounded by family and friends, with Dorothy serving as an honorary grandmother figure, and Richard and Marcus both attending as cherished friends who had helped protect our home. The house had gone from being a source of stress and conflict to being the foundation of a life I loved. The fight to preserve it had been difficult, but it had also connected me to a community of people who cared about the same things I did. It had given me purpose and taught me that standing up for what matters is always worth the cost. 5 years after inheriting my great-grandfather's house, I added another section to the binder that documented its history. This section included newspaper clippings about the Preservation Award, photographs from the documentary, letters from people across the country who had been inspired by the story, and my own reflections on what the experience had taught me. This house was built with care by people who valued beauty and excellence, I wrote. It was preserved by my great-grandfather through decades of loving maintenance. When it was threatened, I fought to protect it because some things are too precious to lose. If you are reading this, you are probably the next caretaker of this remarkable property. Guard it well. Honor its history. Stand firm against anyone who would diminish or destroy what makes it special. You are not just protecting a building. You are preserving a piece of human achievement and a connection to those who came before us. I closed the binder and placed it back on its shelf, confident that the story it told would guide whoever came after me. The evening sun was casting long shadows across the porch as I finished my coffee and prepared to go inside. The house stood solid and beautiful, its Victorian details sharp against the sky, its stained glass windows beginning to glow as interior lights came on. This was home. This was heritage. This was what it meant to be a custodian of something meaningful. And I had protected it, not just for myself, but for everyone who would come after me, and for a community that was rediscovering the value of its architectural past. The fight had been worth it. Every moment of stress, every legal bill, every confrontation with the HOA. All of it had been worth it to ensure that this beautiful, irreplaceable house would stand for another century. As I walked inside, I paused in the doorway and looked back at the street. The neighborhood was quiet in the evening light. Other historic homes stood proudly alongside mine, their owners having been inspired to restore rather than replace, to preserve rather than destroy. The change I had fought for rippled outward far beyond my own property. That was perhaps the most satisfying part of the whole experience. Standing up for what was right had not just saved one house. It had changed how an entire community thought about its history and heritage. I closed the door gently, the original hardware clicking with the same sound it had made for over a century. Inside, Teresa was cooking dinner in the kitchen, and I could smell something delicious. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with life and love, and the promise of many more years of stories still to be written. This was what victory looked like. Not just a legal win or a stopped HOA, but a living, thriving connection between past and present. A refusal to let beauty and craftsmanship be forgotten, and a home that would continue to inspire and shelter for generations to come.